Hello, this is the Harboring Light. I'm Mary. I'll give a conservative perspective about the world around me. Feedback is immensely important. Feel free to reach out to me. Okay, so two ways to do this is through email and, of course, YouTube. Comments are greatly important. Feel free to reach out to me. And feedback is greatly important. It helps with the development of the channel. Also, word of mouth works tremendously. And I appreciate all the listeners out there, and I appreciate all the support, everything else. And you have somebody you think would be very interested in my show content and all of the topics that I cover, let them know about the Harboring Light. Okay, so it's Friday, so I'm focusing in on current events. Alright, so this time I'm going to give my thoughts about the aspects of John Hughes and his legacy with a recent article that came out about him. Alright, here we go. Alright, so to be exact, there was a Variety article talking about this. Excuse me. To be exact, last week, August 8th, was released about Anthony McCall talking to Variety, saying that John Hughes did have plans for a sequel for The Breakfast Club. It was very interesting because he was saying that it would have been something like them being in their 30s and recanting, talking about hashing out what it was like and everything else. And that would have been really interesting. And so I'm going to get into that. Now, initially, me finding out about John Hughes films, and it started with 16 Candles, and then the Breakfast Club, and then Pretty in Pink. And when I was about 15, that was back when it was still video stores. And I heard about John Hughes, but I was like, okay, let me check it out for myself. And so John Hughes, it was really I don't know, he really had that down with the aspects of being honest about the experiences teenagers go through. And when Anthony Michael Hall was talking about him speaking to John Hughes and John Hughes talking about everything, because he was saying this was not too long before his untimely death, and it's rough when you have illnesses, and especially from what I understand, John Hughes had a heart attack. That's really devastating. So he was saying he had all these plans, and then Anthony Michael Hall was like, oh yeah, and his perspective about it. And I'll link this for you. And it's really interesting, even though, and that says a lot about someone's character too. Even though a lot of time has passed and careers and everything else has developed with John Hughes and Anthony McCall and all these kind of things, to still have that kind of rapport with each other, reach out to each other, and have that dynamic, that says a lot, and it really comes across very well in the respect to the way his movies were, John Hughes, because they were very they were coming of age, but they weren't vacuumed, where it it's very pretentious. And that's what got the ball rolling when when we get into the aspects of movies that came out in the 90s and so forth. John Hughes helped lay the foundation in the aspects of, talking about what young people go through and everything else doesn't quite work when you have actors that are actually adults trying to portray that, because before movies like his came along, you had assorted films that were touching on the aspects of adolescence and stuff like that, but they were either overly dramatic. It was just an extreme. There was no in between, and that's what was really interesting to me. And going back to when I was looking for movies to watch, back still because I was still towards the end of when Blockbuster Hollywood Video was still a thing. When we get into the early to mid 2000s, right? And so it really caught my attention when I was reading these films, because I could easily relate. And because unfortunately, when you get into high school and sort of things like this, you have all those different experiences that you necessarily go through, but it's like it's something where does it really have to be that way, right? And that, from my point of view, when you initially see it as a teenager, like if you choose to watch these films as a teenager, or if you are interested in watching these films as a teenager, and then like if an anniversary comes out of it about it, and then you happen to be an adult at the time, or so forth, or you want to revisit it when you're an adult, when you look at it, it's like, you realize, when you're a teenager, it's either, does it really have to be that way? Like, certain circumstances, it seemed like it might drive up for things to have that kind of dynamic. And and then you realize that things aren't as serious as it seems then versus now, and all these kind of things, and it makes you realize that. And then he didn't always, and what was really interesting about John Hughes, he didn't always stay in that realm with the aspects of coming of age films. Of course, that's where he got his fame and made his notoriety. But movies like Uncle Buck, it got Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Home Alone, versus 16 Candles, but in this instance, The Breakfast Club and everything else. What do these films have in common, even though they're vastly different in the subject matter? What they have in common is the aspects of family and isolation, or family, or coming to terms with something, and being honest about something when you really don't want to. And it's really interesting too when you add in the aspects of fan theories. Because most of the time, when you add in the aspects of fan theories when it comes to John Hughes films, they either have to do with Christianity or they have to do with the aspects of, in the case of Home Alone, operative, or, and also more sinister, the aspects of evil, horror. When you break those down, they can have, religious undertones if you look at it too. And that in itself says a lot about also his disposition, because he said a lot when he was interviewed, and he was asked different questions about what is your inspiration with your films, like what inspires you. And he said, when I'm trying to think exactly from what I remember. So he was saying along the lines of, I just wanted to be honest about my experience when I was growing up, because he grew up in the Midwest, around Chicago and around that area. And that is a very different experience for someone who, grew up, in the South, or who grew up more up north, where you get into the New York territories, or you get someone who grew on the west or east or something. But most of the time, which is very poignant about what I was saying with tie this into what I was talking about last week with the aspects of things that are successful, as far as what some people consider with spinoffs, and then just rehashing what has already been done. When someone takes the liberty to take a chance on showcasing the experience that they lived in an artistic way, and they're really genuine about it, that comes across quite well. And if you give it time, a lot of people respond to it pretty well. And John Hughes is a really good example of that. And I think that's why his movies will always have a lot of relevance, no matter what time period it is or generation it is. There's something in his films that somebody can take away from. And even though it's unfortunately being pushed where, there's something normalizing the aspects of not having a nuclear family, or it's not important to have an extended family, or family is not really important. What's more important is self-indulgence, or more important to always internalize what's all in your own head, and not really taking consideration of what other people think. Believe it or not, even though it's that same adage, when you look at it, the loudest wagon gets the most attention because there's nothing in it, and it makes the most noise, right? But that's the only reason why it's getting attention, because it's making the most noise and there's nothing there. So people are shouting all these ridiculous things because they're very boisterous with nothing to say. But if we want to be really honest with ourselves, thinking like that, having selfish mentalities and just having all these extreme agendas, normal people don't really, relate to that kind of stuff. And if you never perpetually go through milestones, you're not really seeking those things out, they really play themselves in a wrong direction, and that's very detrimental in the aspects of cultural development, and also when you think the fabric of what can be passed down. And so a lot of times when we look with John, and also what I think is very relatable in the aspects of John Hughes films, they call the characters to come to terms with milestones, right? And that's what's so odd about a lot of things that are coming out now, which they have the label as they have to meet these agendas in order to be appeasing to the higher ups in entertainment, when it's just very polarizing, right? For instance, the Odyssey. Now I'm gonna rehash this because it's like it's so many other people that have said it, and I've said it already, but I'm just gonna rehash this because it's on top of another level of a really good example. Now, the Odyssey is one of those things where when you look at the rich history of it, you have to be very respectful of the source, because the Odyssey is pertaining to the aspects of things that are relevant, or still relevant to Greek culture. And if you don't take the time to understand that all of these notations and references, and you come in it with the agenda, we have to put our own politics into it, and it doesn't really matter about the developed source of where it came from. It seems disingenuous, and people are gonna not give it any credit. Just write it off as another thing that somebody has done to push an agenda on, when that's really unfortunate, because there's a lot of relevant messages in the Odyssey that a lot of people can relate to. And then it also ties back with the aspects of touching on milestones in life in order for people to become more productive in their culture, in order for the culture to strive and move forward and be more enlightened. And I think that's what needs to be treasured and protected, when we come to the arts, and when we think about entertainment. Because, for instance, before and after John Hughes came along, the actors who were a part of the Brat Pack, they have contributed, and they still contribute to a lesser extent in different ways. Even it's unfortunate that some of them just have these weird mentalities about their disposition with the woke mentality, which is unfortunate, because that's them personally, their issue. But you also, even though they're personally doing things that are not, I don't agree with, or very harmful to the fabric of the development of American values and the development of Western civilization here. That's neither said nor done. What's important is them being a part of something bigger than themselves, right? Which that's what you give respect to, and that's what you think about, right? All right, so let's get back to that. Okay, so now before, as I mentioned, I'm gonna reiterate this again. There was just this. For example, even though it's raunchy, Porky's, something like that. Movies like that, they were, and then Animal House, they were like a very niche things that would be, more, some people would refer to that more as male humor, but they happen to be things that were youth oriented. But it was a thing where something melodramatic happened, and something like with the boy in the bubble with John Travolta, or something like Ice Castles, or something like Love Story. And then also Grease was very interesting, because Grease was tipping the toes, moving the memento in the aspects of doing something new, where before Grease, it was just, when it comes to musicals, it wasn't a breakup to where it was a variation of people. It was one of those things where, I like musicals, but at a point I was like, oh my gosh, because and it was, I'm very appreciative of movies like Grease, and then Grease in itself, because they understood that it's off-putting to sit there for however long, and all they ever do is just sing everything, and there's no kind of situational place in the movie where they're just talking, conversing. And Grease was one of those that did that, but at the same time, it was the campiness and not being very genuine with the aspects of teenage experience. It was kind of all over the place, but that was really neat what they were doing. They were taking a chance with that, and it really worked well. Now, when John Hughes came along, he said, okay, well, I bet you one more tier here. Let's be even more genuine in the aspects of the teenage experience, but instead of doing this thing where it's older people and adults portraying teenage life, it's actually teenagers who are doing this, and see how that works. And it worked very well, because it was more genuine and it was more relatable, and that was that was very successful. And so my whole point of bringing all this up is I think moving forward, when we think about the aspects of what impacts culture, and the aspects of things that are healthier for culture and help with more engaged conversations, people, things that can be beneficial for the growth of success for culture and other generations, is to look towards things that give more, that engage more meaning beyond oneself, or that is mindful of those things, where it's not something hard to do. And I'll close with this. So when there was I'll say it again, it's still on, if I'm not mistaken, it's still on Hulu. I give a lot of respect for this documentary. I'm trying to think about Andrew McCarthy was the forerunner of making this big thing. He was giving his interpretation of the aspects of what it was like with youth entertainment before they came along the backpack and after, and then the article that came out by saying that they're pretentious, when it turns out this guy who came out with this article slandering, trying to slander, really, and it was unfortunate that they took that to heart when they should have just ran with it and just said, okay, but it's one of those things. It's a life lesson. But they like I said, what was really good at, I'm saying, most of them still just managed to transition themselves into other careers and made it work for them. But a really good example of that, and say, okay, whatever, and they learn, and it's unfortunate. It's one of those things. Sometimes, in tragedy, opportunities happen, unfortunately. But when you think about the transition, and I'll get back to this documentary with Andrew McCarthy. So, the 90s, when 90210, that kind of crowd came along. They took it and ran with it, and they say, hey, this is us, like it or not. Hey, we're gonna, make this work for us. And it really did. And it was really interesting how that transitioned and changed the cultural landscape of the 90s too, with this aspects of teenage life and Gen X and all that. So that, that's another really good example of cultivating something for good or for a bad. There's not the Gen X is one of those strange things where they are very best way I can describe that, they were really Gen Xers that, I'm just saying from my point of view, where, from, even though I'm a millennial, it's one of those things where, you may do with what kind of label, but, I am who I am, even though I happen to be a millennial. But the way this position is like, having that mentality with Gen X, making the best out of bad situations. Like, that's kind of like their thing, their trademark, when you look at it. And, okay, so going back to the Brat Pack with Andrew McCarthy. Now, I really appreciate this documentary because it was really candid in the aspects of saying that, well, see, you at some point have to come to terms with something. You have to come to terms with mistakes and everything else, and then trying to figure out solutions and all of that. And the documentary really highlighted that very well. And I can't stress enough, I really appreciate the aspects of what John Hughes has given to pop culture. And, I think that, closing out on my thoughts with the week, I think that's what needs to be protected and thought about, when we move on and we look at things that are relevant in pop culture. What's the give and take of it? Like, is it, how is this beneficial? How is it not? What's the worth? What's the merit of it? So that's just my penny of thoughts for the current week here. All right, if you want to extend this conversation, reach out to me. Email is best. And I always encourage YouTube comments. Alright, so this reaches the end of the Harboring Light. Tune in, turn up, and definitely take care out there. Bye-bye for now.